Tonight we're both in the lecture, panel discussion, and film business. My portion of the introduction is to introduce to you a remarkable person who has distinguished herself in many different realms. She is a producer, a director, a screenwriter. Tonight she is the person who produced and did much of the writing for the sneak preview that you're going to see. But her work for GBH and the American Experience series has made her among the most watched of all producers in the world. And her shows on Grant and the Rockefellers and Nixon and the Civil War are just part of her amazing work. Her Emmy Award-winning series on the Kennedys certainly is probably known by everyone here. But she has departed occasionally, and her Emmy-nominated special presentation on rock and roll was, I thought, pretty remarkable. And her presentation, which also received quite a bit of recognition in terms of awards on Vietnam, is something that clearly is an important part of the history of that era in American history. It gives me great pleasure to welcome tonight and to introduce to you Elizabeth Deane.
Thank you, Bernie. Can you hear me? My voice doesn't carry very well, so shout out and make me shout. John Adams loved books, and he loved libraries, and he cared fiercely about education. Abigail Adams was homeschooled, as David McCullough describes it, as girls were then. But she was her husband's intellectual match, hungry to read and to learn. So it was good news for us to hear that we would be able to screen part of our film in this great library, where John Adams's own books are part of the collection, along with his many and often irreverent notes in the margins. He started to come alive for me when I first saw those notes, when I was beginning to read and do research on the film. Now, we've all been told we're not supposed to write in books, but that was how Adams came to grips with what he was reading, by arguing with the writer and writing the arguments in the margin. He could be brutal. Quack, he wrote of one author's cherished argument. Fool, absurd, ridiculous, delirious. This is wicked misrepresentation, he wrote of a passage in A History of the French Revolution. You can see that one on the American Experience website for the film, as well as here in the Rare Books collection. Getting those glimpses of the actual man sputtering, you imagine him just sputtering as he wrote, that brilliant mind churning away, was exciting, but it made us anxious too. How could we do justice to this complex and brilliant man, and to the wife who was really his match in every way? How could we bring these remarkable people to life on film when we were working in a time before photography? There were no still photos and really very few visual images of any kind to help us tell the story. Well, we looked at a lot of earlier films on the Revolutionary period, both documentaries and feature films. And most felt so remote from real life and real people. The characters so stiff and tidy in their corsets and wigs. I personally think wigs are the biggest problem. It's such an alien appendage to a modern eye. It's very distancing, I think, and made worse by the bad wigs in most films. We became connoisseurs of wigs as we made this film. But the key for us was not in the wigs. The key for us in overcoming that great distance lay in the Adams letters. There are over 1,000 of them. Between John and Abigail, most kept right here in Boston, as Bernie mentioned, at the Massachusetts Historical Society, our co-presenters tonight, and available to all of us, not just those of us lucky enough to live in Boston, on their superb website. The Adams letters make up one of the greatest correspondences in American history. Intelligent, articulate, intimate, often deeply revealing. There are few figures in history who tell us so much, not only about themselves, but about their times. So it was the letters that took us forward, inching ahead as we worked on the script, towards what you will see in a few minutes. It's what some people call a drama documentary, which means that we have incorporated dramatic sequences into the film. It's a risky step for documentary makers because the chance of failure is very high. It can be clunky. If it's cheesy, whatever, it'll just pull your viewer right out of the historical moment and the film is dead. But as we worked on the script, revision after revision, there came a moment when it was clear that if we ventured into this, into dramatic sequences, we would not have to invent any dialogue. And we would not have felt comfortable doing that with these characters. But we found we could build dramatic scenes from the letters, from the voices of John and Abigail. And what a privilege it was to have two great writers right beside me as I wrote. The lines you hear, spoken by John and Abigail, came from their pens, not mine. And besides, how can you resist a letter from John to Abigail that begins, "Dear Miss Saucy"? That was our favorite name for Abigail on the set. Miss Saucy, God. The fateful decision to go the drama documentary route, though, was sealed when two superb actors, Simon Russell Beale and Linda Emond, agreed to take on the roles of John and Abigail. We shot almost everything right around here, in Quincy, Salem, Lexington, Acorn Street on Beacon Hill. You can judge for yourselves whether we have succeeded. But with hometown pride, we're pleased to show you the first hour. The entire 2-hour film airs on Monday, January 23rd, on the PBS series American Experience, based right here in Boston at WGBH. Here is John and Abigail Adams, Hour 1.
I'm Peter Drummey, the librarian of the Massachusetts Historical Society. As President Margolis pointed out, we're located about 500 street numbers further up Boylston Street here. And under my care are the Adams family papers. That's the largest and most important collection of manuscripts in the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is primarily a manuscript repository. Our plan for this evening is, I'm going to introduce you in a minute to our people who give you a general comment, then ask them some questions, get their thoughts about what we've just seen and some background information about it, and then turn to you in the audience to answer whatever questions you have. And Elizabeth Deane has graciously offered to also assist us in answering questions about the film. What I hope we can do this evening is to provide some historical context for the portion of the film that we've just watched. I'm not talking about minute details of whether John Adams is looking in the right direction when he sits in his desk, although I think Kelly Cobble can probably answer that for us, but rather what we need to know by way of background about this period, to put John and Abigail Adams into the context of their own time. Tonight we have two experts on this period and these specific people to hear from and then to question. This is not a film review that we are about to do, but an opportunity to use the film as a springboard for a discussion of a time and place and the people who inhabited it. First, let me introduce Kelly Cobble, who is curator of the Adams National Historical Park in Quincy. Her position includes researching, cataloging, and preserving the personal artifacts that belong to 5 generations of the Adams family, including Presidents John and John Quincy Adams and their wives. The collection she's responsible for spans 4 centuries and includes portraits, prints, decorative art, silver, furniture, porcelain, archives, books, and archaeological materials. All the objects under her care are original to the Adams family and reflect the numerous diplomatic missions and the times in which they lived. I might add that Kelly recognizes and celebrates the role the Adams family themselves played as preservationists and their contribution for preserving history through their letters, art, buildings, and land. Jonathan Chu is Associate Professor of History and Associate Dean of the College of Education at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He was born and grew up in Honolulu, attending a school founded by 19th century New England Congregational missionaries. Jonathan received his BA in American Civilization, as it was known then, at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was first introduced to the Adams Papers in a senior seminar. He received his MA at the University of Hawaii and his PhD from the University of Washington. He also has a master's degree in the study of law from Yale, and that might be some help tonight because in starting more or less in the middle of the story of the lives of John and Abigail Adams, we've gone by John Adams's career as a lawyer here in Boston in the years before the Revolution. Having written on Quaker descent in New England, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and Daniel Webster's drinking habits, Jonathan is currently engaged in the study of the legal and economic impacts of the American Revolution. So, Kelly, do you want to tell us what your first thoughts are here?
Okay. Well, at the Adams National Historical Park in Quincy, we have the evidence that belonged to John and Abigail and the true physical material that tells us the stories of John and Abigail and the rest of the family. So we've been telling this story for a long time. Actually, the park was given by the Adams family to the National Park Service in 1946, and we've been giving tours of the house ever since. So our jobs just have become much easier in the past couple of years, especially with the work of David McCullough and Joseph Ellis, and now the film. This will really bring the park to the general public, and from April 19th to November 10th, you can come see the original birthplaces of both the presidents, get a feel for the atmosphere, the true buildings in which they lived, and then also see the summer president's home and where John and Abigail actually died. So we have the original artifacts, we have buildings, we have the grounds that we still preserve today. So that's what's very exciting for us. And again, not to leave Abigail out of the equation at all, I think this film is a great job at showing them as equal partners, and I think that's what's going to be the most exciting part of our discussion tonight.
Could you just take a minute to remind us where they came from, their families?
Well, John actually, he was fifth descendant of a man who emigrated from England. Can't think of the town off the top of my head now, but John had been settled in Braintree. He grew up in Braintree. His father was a deacon in the church, very involved with the public. He was a farmer, and many of his influences are again shown on the big screen. His parents were both very honest, passionate, hardworking, and public servants, as well as very religious, and that really is.
But plain people.
right, and represented well.
Jonathan?
Thank you, Peter. I'd like to start off by saying that in some ways for me the story of John Adams is personal, because I remember as a senior at the University of Pennsylvania going through his letters, and one of the letters that I read was especially poignant for me, and sort of looking back at it in retrospect. It's a letter he writes when he's out in Worcester teaching school and trying to decide what he's going to do with his life. Will he be a lawyer? Will he be a teacher? Will he dare great thoughts? Will he stay for the more mundane life? And it was a path or a decision that I was going through at the same time. And what this film also brings out and closes in this particular hour that I also think is especially important is David McCullough's last comment about, imagine this, the farmer's son who is going to stand before the King of England. And I think in some ways the Adams story is not just a wonderful love story, but it's a story of the American ideals we would hope to have in terms of opportunities and in terms of life choices that people have. Having said all of that, I think this film also touches upon a number of things which have to be done because of the economy of the medium that touch upon some really complex ideas, some obvious ambiguities. Will this experiment succeed? This is not clear. What does it take for something like this to succeed? Abigail says, this is a good time for men for genius. These are the great challenges bring out great virtues. So there's this level of weighing the possibilities and seeing the ambiguities and seeing the way people of strong character can help to change the outcome. There are also some complex things that are layered in here that are only passed over quickly in terms of context. Who's running the farm? And how's it succeeding? And in point of fact, I think, and I'll stop and allow for questions at this, is Abigail is this wonderful entrepreneur. If she'd been Donald Trump, she would have owned New York City.
Can we just follow that up just for a minute and talk about this description of her as being homeschooled? We know, remind everyone that John Adams had graduated from Harvard College, across the river here. But Abigail Adams, Kelly, can you speak a little bit about her education and what she had read?
Well, of course.
The books are right upstairs here.
Well, she was homeschooled, and her father would be a minister, which would be the most educated person or respected person at the time, which, of course, there was even some doubt when John and Richard Cranch came around courting. But eventually, as we know, it turned out to be a good match. But it was her father, and then it was also the influence of her mother's family. And the side note, the Adamses did tend to marry up. The men of the family would tend to marry up. And so Abigail had the influence of the Quincy family that had been well established in this area. And so her grandmother, Elizabeth Quincy, had a huge influence on her in directing her in books to be read and, again, promoting that public servant attribute. And then her mother as well was seen as an equal in her family as well as a good influence.
And Jonathan, could you say a little bit about, here we're in Boston, about the Massachusetts Constitution, about how important that is in this story?
John really does capture one of the careful balances that it takes the rest of the country and the Constitutional Convention months and months to work out. One of the problems he and everyone else faces is having fought a war for liberty. There's this kind of natural predisposition to fear government, to fear the exercise of power. And what the rest of the country won't sense until the mid-1780s, 1784, 85, and 86, is the danger of that approach. If your predisposition is to avoid government or to restrict government's power, there's a natural tendency to swing too far, as Americans did. And part of the debates that go on over the Constitution is to bring the pendulum back into balance, to sort of bring those checks and balances back together. John knows almost instinctively how to do this with the Massachusetts Constitution. That's why it becomes so critical to sort of framing the understanding of what needs to happen in the allocation of power and liberty. The answer that he comes up with is an answer that takes another 5 to 6 years for people and a lot of debate of great minds to figure out. He figures out the three-part balance among the three separate branches of government. He understands the necessity to create an executive that can act decisively, but is at the same time restricted and curbed from becoming a tyrant. It speaks a great deal to his kind of no-nonsense ability to simply cut to the chase and get to the point of synthesis quickly and carefully at the same time.
I'm just going to ask everyone, if you have questions, if you could just raise your hand and then stand up and speak so we can all hear you. And then if I think someone is speaking quietly, I'll try to repeat the question and turn to our commentators to answer for you. But is there anything we can tell you about this period and these people? We have some wonderful expertise in the room here. Sure. In the back, in the center? All the way back. Yes, you, sir.
I noticed while life was rough for Abigail, she did have servants. She had help. They didn't strike me as poor. And I was wondering if you could amplify on that, their economic situation, their own personal financial situation.
Sure. Kelly, do you want to speak about the Adams household?
Well, they were by no means wealthy. John had been a very successful lawyer during his early married life, and he had inherited the farm where their children were born. So he had, a little bit of edge on life, very comfortable to begin with, anyway. The war has a huge impact on their economy. And then once he becomes a diplomat and traveling to Philadelphia and really sacrificing his career, the income practically stops. So again, it turns to Abigail to be a shrewd, economical manager of the farm and really survived on what they had. Many times, again, through her letters, we find out that she survives on a barter system. At one point, she writes to John saying that paper money has no value, and that she is actually trading some of the objects that he can send her from abroad. And again, just a very shrewd and very capable working person. And again, the economy depended on these people that were tended in more servitude, and sometimes it wasn't for wages, it would be just for a place over their head.
Jonathan, could you say a little bit about Abigail Adams as entrepreneur in terms of investment and speculation?
Part of the reason she's resorting to this barter system is the Revolution is a period in which an enormous inflation takes place. A large part of the workforce is removed. Price of agricultural commodities start to skyrocket. When you've got these cycles of inflation and then subsequent to the war, deflation, as the old stockbroker will tell you, timing is everything. She has an almost instinctive understanding of how inflation and the cycles of inflation and the money supply works. So when she's talking about paper money, she immediately starts to look around for commodities which will keep pace with the rate of inflation. And so she starts asking John to send back handkerchiefs, ribbons, needles, pins, which will keep pace with the patterns of inflation as she sells them off. By 1780, she writes to Mercy Otis Warren and she says, I think you ought to stop buying handkerchiefs. And Mercy Otis Warren sends back a couple of letters, I guess about a month or so later, saying, I can't sell any handkerchiefs. So she's got this sense of how to profit from inflation. When land prices start to drop off, when the war is starting to grind to a halt and people understand that soldiers are going to be coming back to the farms, that the price of grain is probably going to drop, she starts buying. And John says, no, you shouldn't be making these purchases. And she writes back, no, this woodlot I've bought is cheap at the price, and I figure out that within 2 years I could sell off the wood to Boston for the purchase price of the farm, for the land. So she's really got this enormously wonderful sense of how to invest. And so she's bartering, and she's got servants, but she complains about the price of labor. She has a worker that one year she says works for $6 for the season, and now he's holding her up for $8. She's a wonderful entrepreneur. I have a chapter in the book I'm working on, and I'm wondering whether it's sort of small Abigail, or the title will be Abigail Adams Holding Company.
There was a question here, and yeah.
I was curious about sort of the coloration of Abigail in the production, because, for example, she has that little bit where she's talking about the times requiring genius, or they will bring it out. But if you read that in context, it's much more admonitory to John Quincy. She comes across as a really very tough mother. And I also remember reading a letter of John Quincy to his mother when he was 10 or 11. It was an astonishingly formal, pompous letter from out of the hand of a 10 or 11-year-old. And so I wonder whether this is a question of the style of the times that it casts, maybe projects this falsely, or whether, in fact, we're seeing a coloration that's colored to be more modern.
If I could jump in here just for a couple of things and then call upon Elizabeth. One thing I'd point out is, and I think you're absolutely right, is one thing that's sort of wonderful is we have this very rich archive for this family. I think you're right about John Quincy Adams's letters is very, it's reading his letters you can think he was never young. But if you look at the same time, look at the diary kept as a 10 or 11-year-old when he was sailing across the Atlantic, and what has been aptly depicted in this winter voyage, saw it as, through a child's eyes, as this great adventure. Nothing was quite so wonderful as when in firing the guns, testing the guns in the ship, someone blew some of their fingers off. But he is in we have this full picture of these people. I think in doing something like this, I'm sure there are questions of selection and decision that have to be made. And here we're covering in this hour a period of about 12 years. And the following hour, Elizabeth Deane covers 40 years in the period of an hour. But Elizabeth, do you want to add anything to this? Here, and we should sit up.
So don't go far. It's just, that's not how I read that text. These are the times in which a genius would wish to live. But, and also we were trying to build a scene from a letter. And I know what you mean. You could have her say, these are the times in which a genius would wish to live, dodo head, something more sterner, because she did certainly have that side to her. But I'm curious what you think. We're always making these decisions,
Well, I'm going to take the easy way out and sort of point out that at the Massachusetts Historical Society's website, we have digital images and transcriptions of this body of letters exchanged by John Quincy Adams with his parents in his youth. And everyone here can go to that place and make this decision for themselves. But I think this is an interesting point in a decision about what to emphasize in it. But I think that idea that they were living at this sort of, as John Adams is apt to say, in about every other letter he writes, there's an epocha that he's living at. And Abigail Adams often refers to her bursting heart in terms of what describing the events of this time. But
Yeah.
along those lines, but I think we were more focused also on that idea of their awareness of the historical moment. You know, they knew that these were historic times that they were living in. And it's threaded through the whole story. You know, there's so many.
And I also just want to add that it isn't a coincidence that John Quincy Adams became a president. I mean, he was literally groomed. And when you do read their letters, there are insights such as those, and that is really what Abigail and John were keeping in John Quincy's forefront of his mind. That's why he went on that voyage. It was because he would have opportunities to see a larger world. And again, John and Abigail grew to the people they were, coming from small circumstances, and they were already presenting the next generation by sending them out on the ocean.
Kelly, could you say something about the admonition of John Adams to his children to keep diaries and letters, how this sort of family archive began and was assembled?
Well, all I can repeat is what Elizabeth started with. And from our material culture point of view at the park is books, books, books. Again, books. Actually, when George W. Bush was elected, we were contacted. Again, the baseball cap incident came about, and George Sr. had passed on a baseball cap to George W. And so Newsweek called us up and said, what do you have for gifts that John Adams presented to John Quincy Adams when he became president? And I said, the only thing that we have are books. That there's only evidence that if they ever gave a gift to each other, among the family, it was always books. And that's really what we have of artifacts that they treasured. So I actually got very excited with that opening scene of John packing his books, because I do have the pleasure of working with John Quincy Adams's books and a small fraction of John Adams's books. And, I get to handle them. I love the touch. I love the feel. And I again, was very excited with that progress. And they were aware of the history in the making, and they recorded it. And again, why we have the evidence that we have today is because John went above and beyond and made copies of his correspondence, of his letters, as well as the diaries. And both John and Abigail used up every inch of the page, any possible piece of paper that was left. So besides his immense education, his largest library of the time, which again he passed on to his son and grandchildren, it was a passion that was just deep-rooted in the family.
Here in the front.
Any comment on the relationship between Jefferson and Adams? They seem friendly. I guess it was a high point there. Then they become political rivals again. They become friends again.
This is a great lead into the second part of this film, but it's...
I was about to say, the second part, I think, deals with this really, really nicely. The way in which the election of 1800 really separates them and makes them very bitter. And again, building on the theme that even as late as 1800, Adams isn't sure that the experiment is going to take hold. that's a long time, and we're going from 1775 now. This is moving on to a quarter of a century, where the structures are still in doubt, and then sort of the reaction after the fact, and then Adams. I think it was very deftly done, Elizabeth Deane, which John sends off the letter, and then they start the correspondence again, and I think the closing scenes, how they built the scene. Where they both die on the same day is really quite touching, I think, and speaks volumes about the way in which that relationship, which is touched on in this first hour, and then builds in the second hour.
I think it is an important point, though, is that as at the end, when they're in France together, that they're close personal friends, John Adams and colleagues in their work. But I think the relationship between Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who are about the same age, and remember, Thomas Jefferson by this time is a widower with young children that he's brought with him to France and is bringing up, so that naturally he's turning to Abigail Adams in some respects as someone for advice, but also a close personal connection between them. In the back here. Oh.
Absolutely, yes, and they're in safekeeping.
This is the Bible. Here in the middle. Elizabeth, would you want to? I mean, I think there's a point here in sort of telling a story briefly, but I think in terms of the synthesis of ideas in the Massachusetts Constitution, I'll turn this to Jonathan, who I think is more knowledgeable about this. But I think at the same time there's the idea that the role of John Adams in bringing together the text that as we know it largely today is a remarkable story, and I think is accurately captured where those ideas came from, just as in the writing of the Declaration of Independence. The same sort of path takes place of Jefferson's own writings before the manuscript of the Declaration is created, and where the ideas expressed in it came from, looking back to Europe, England, and Scotland, and France.
In some ways, the structure that Adams uses for the Constitution, the Massachusetts Constitution, is not a very unique or original one. It's basically the old colonial government, and it's a pattern that's used and replicated in a number of different places, with minor variation in terms of the election of both houses, and the extent to which the governor or the royal governor's powers extend throughout the system. Some of it also depends on the way in which, whether it's a proprietary government that is owned by a single individual like William Penn. So in that respect, the structure isn't terribly remarkable. What is remarkable is that Adams sort of guesses or speculates on the way in which it meets the end of the whole revolutionary debate. If you start off with the premise that government is inherently, well, let me restate that. If imperial government is inherently evil and problematic because government tends to grow exponentially and to be filled with people who will seek power, then the problem comes is how do you check that power to preserve liberty? And the immediate solution for most of the revolutionary governments, state governments, is to curb executive authority, to figure out a way in which to make the Congress or the legislative branch supreme. Well, this leads to the absolute extreme on the pendulum of the Pennsylvania state constitution, which has only one House legislature and an executive committee of 13. Makes it really hard to come to any kind of decision, to raise revenues, to recruit soldiers. And what Adams does is to come up with a kind of rationale that others will pick up on. It's not that he's really original in terms of conception. What is original is the way in which he's bringing all of these ideas together and synthesizing them 5 years before anyone else is starting to figure out how to do this. And yes, he's borrowing from lots of different places. The whole idea of checks and balances he gets from political theorists writing about the Glorious Revolution in 1688. The notions of human rights and liberties he's drawing out. He's looking for alternative sources of authority that are outside of government. So I think what you're addressing is something that's kind of a problem, but I think what's really quite wonderful is the way in which this film sort of can only touch on some of these very complex issues that are raised.
Sure.
I mean, there's a filmmaking explanation, or you'll be amused at a scene that was cut. When he's packing his books at the beginning, when he's going to go to Philadelphia, we had a part where Abigail is putting these books in and listing off all the philosophers that you probably had in mind, and kind of exasperated. You're taking this and this and this. And he just says, yes. You know, those were the things that he needed. But, you know, there we are with our 2 hours and our very hard decisions to make. But just for you, I wanted you to know that.
Anything else?
Well, I will also just add that little reality piece that I have. Again, he couldn't part with those philosophers and the historians, but on the practical side, she was also making provisions for him to bring a cow. You know, how many cases of wheat and coffee and sugar and clothing, everything that he would need to survive, you know, for 3 to 9 months, he brought with him. So, I mean, it's quite amazing to bring a cow as well.
Here?
Just to straighten out my timetable, is the final scene where Adam is going to London and so forth, is that where are we with respect to the French Revolution then?
We're still before the French Revolution, that is. The question was the final scenes of this, where we stopped, where Adams is being presented as the minister to the court of St. James, as our ambassador in England. Where is that in relationship to the outbreak of the French Revolution? And that's still several years before. Adams will return to America before the French Revolution begins. Anything else? If we don't know the answer, we'll make it up.
I had one other question. That was, you spoke about the Adams as the writer of the Constitution of Massachusetts, and then that being used as the basis of the U.S. Constitution. Was there anything in the Massachusetts Constitution that they said that was a blunder and we'll change it for the U.S. Constitution? Or was there some evolution in the process?
Let me just repeat that, is that the question is about if you think of the Massachusetts state constitution as a building block towards the federal constitution, where there are changes and what was discarded in terms of writing the federal constitution. And Jonathan, you want to speak to that?
One of the things that the Massachusetts State Constitution did was to establish property qualifications for holding office. They were hierarchical in nature. I think it was 300, 600, and 1,000. 1,000 to be governor, 600 pounds of landed estate, assessed landed estate, to be in the upper house, and 300 to be in the lower house. When obviously the Constitution is the federal Constitution is drafted, that's changed to age qualifications. One of the reasons for that is Madison figured out very quickly is that if you use property qualifications, it was in everybody's interest to lie about this, particularly for the purposes of the House of Representatives. And the logic goes, well, the wealthiest states will have the most people. So let's use that as a way of defining who gets to be a congressman. And then we'll use age. People who are 25 generally have more money than people who are 20, and so forth. And the idea actually goes back to a kind of colonial sensibility that, in some ways, the older you were and the more wealth you had, generally the more independent one could be, and thus wiser, less affected, less likely to be corrupted by power or what power can get for you. Lessons that that's the theory.
If I could just point out a couple, this is a really interesting, complicated question. One thing to remember is in the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 as written, Massachusetts at that time and for more than 40 years thereafter would have an established church. That is, in Massachusetts, you paid taxes to support your church. This is Puritan, growing out of Puritan Massachusetts still, that the separation that we understand coming out of the federal Constitution between church and state exists here in a very different way. It's also the case there's a much stronger protection of personal liberties in the Massachusetts State Constitution. You're not looking to the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, the equivalent, is embedded in the Massachusetts Constitution. And last, I'd point out that in interpreting the Massachusetts State Constitution in cases arising in the 1780s, very quickly after the Massachusetts Constitution was adopted, slavery ended here in Massachusetts. People sued for their freedom according to the state constitution. And as we know, that slavery is protected in the federal Constitution. So anything else? Well, we thank you all for coming, and I can't tell you, because we've had the good fortune of seeing the second hour of the film. You really have a treat before you in just a few days. Here, just wait. Let me, Elizabeth?
January 23rd, 9 p.m., Channel 2.
Thank you.